naturalism of some.
Okay, recording is on, sorry.
Okay, I'm discussing some skeptical views about free will, especially they come especially from scientists or philosophers who are very scientifically oriented in a way that I'm not very happy with. The form of so-called scientific naturalism or strict naturalism, for which not only our philosophical views should be compatible with the scientific views, and that I perfectly agree with, but that in principle science can solve or dissolve all philosophical riddles. I don't think that's acceptable. So let's, this is a general presentation of some form of scientist that comes from science, directly from science. Not all scientists defend this form of scientism. So they kind of idea that science can solve all problems, only science is reasonable and all these things. But some do, and there are philosophers that welcome these views. So this is from the last book that Stephen Hawking wrote before, oh, sorry, it's misspelled, Hawking, not Hacking, poor guy, but Hawking. So Stephen Hawking and Leonard Lodinoff wrote that philosophy is dead because it has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. That's wrong for two reasons, I think. First, it's not true that all philosophers are unaware of contemporary physics. There are very good philosophers who are perfectly aware of what is happening in frontier science, including physics, quantum mechanics, and theory of relativity, and so on. I did work with Hilary Patram, that certainly was one of those, but now there are others that really know what they're talking about. Plus, the attempts that scientists do of substituting themselves to philosophers in answering philosophical questions are very poor. And I will address now the issue of free will in this sense. But if you want a more general presentation, there is online a very good review by Tim Crane of the book I'm mentioning by Hawking and Modlinoff that is showing how they would like to answer philosophical questions. They totally ignore philosophical traditions, philosophical reasoning, and they come out with very poor theories. But let's be concentrated on free will today. First, let me add one thing that comes from Dawkins. The deep and universal questions of existence and the meaning of life, or any other philosophical questions, are scientific matters which should probably be dealt with in science classes. So this is scientism from a tour, Dawkins, Hawking, some of the main contemporary scientists. And then some philosophers are happy with that. This is Alex Rosenberg from Duke. He writes, science forces upon us a very disillusioned take on reality. It forces us to say no in response to many questions to which almost everyone hopes the answers are yes. What are these questions? These are the questions about the purpose in nature, the meaning of life, the grounds of morality, the significance of consciousness, the character of soul, the freedom of the will, the limits of human self-understanding, and the trajectory of human history. So every philosophical issue is there, and they means no. He is more than a reductionist, he's an eliminativist. He thinks that most of these questions are meaningless and should be just forgotten. So let's go now on free will, and let's test this idea that the issue of free will is a scientific issue, and so it should be solved, if it can be solved, or dissolved, forgotten, using scientific methods. So many philosophers, Metzinger, who is in the picture, in the top picture, Metzinger, Harris, Paul, and Patricia Churchland, and scientists like Frith, Pinker, Gazzaniga, Hawking, Coyne, Dawkins, Haynes, Haggard, that is the bottom picture, Green and Cohen, deny free will on the basis of some alleged scientific evidence against it. Okay, this is their argument. Now let's briefly, let's say something about this bestseller. This was New York Times bestseller by this very famous biologist, Robert Sapolsky. He was a Guggenheim scholar. You know, it's called the Guggenheim Fellowship is called the Genius Fellowship. So super scientists that could plausibly get the Nobel Prize in the future. So he's a super scientist, but he has decided that he's a biologist. So he wants a science of life without free will. And the main argument he uses is condensed in the title, determined. Because we are determined, free will cannot exist. Let's say something more. This is Sapolsky, waiting for the Nobel Prize. So, quotation, we can subtract responsibility out of our view aspects of behavior. And this makes the world a better place. So it's not just that believing in free will is wrong, because there is no such a thing. It's dangerous, it's bad. A huge amount of humanity's misery is due to the myths of free will, okay? Nothing less than a huge amount of humanity's misery. Acknowledging that free will is an illusion, Sapolsky says, will produce a much more human criminal justice system. I will end up my lecture discussing this idea. So he has two ideas here. Free will is an illusion, first point. Second, because it's a very harmful illusion, it's very beneficial to abandon it, especially for the criminal justice system. So free will has to be abandoned, and that will be very good for justice. These are the two ideas he exposes. Other ideas. This is Paul Bloom, super famous psychologist. Most scientists and philosophers agree that free will is an illusion. Now, I don't know if most scientists, there are some, but certainly not most philosophers. There is a famous poll by David Chalmers, and the vast majority, 70% of the philosophers defend free will, even more probably, because they put together all the different versions. Probably 80% of philosophers believe in free will. But anyway, he has these statistics in mind. And then he goes on. Our actions are, in fact, literally predestined, determined by the laws of physics, the state of the universe, long before we were born, and perhaps by random events at the quantum level. We choose none of this, and so free will does not exist. Notice, this is the argument, super condensed, because we are either causally determined, or there are random events that influence our action. So we are not determined, but there is indeterminism at stake in our actions. But in both cases, free will is impossible, okay? Now, let's try to investigate a little more. But first, this is Michael Gazzaniga, another super famous scientist. Is the one of the split brains theory, great neurophysiology. I think we'll get over the idea of free will and accept we are a special kind of machine, one with a moral agency which comes from living in social groups. So the idea is here. Morality, that normally people think it depends on free will, actually depends on evolution in society. So it's a useful tool for keeping social groups together, but it doesn't have any ontological correspondent. Sam Harris, this is a cognitive scientist and a philosopher. His book is called Free Will, and he portrays a puppet in the cover. Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. Okay? We believe we have free will, but we are wrong. This is Ramachandran, other incredibly famous neuroscientist. Free will is even more. It's not just that free will is a wrong theory of wrong belief. It's an inherently flawed and incoherent concept. It's even incoherent for him. Okay, doesn't give a conventional argument that is incoherent, but still he believes that. Now I mentioned at the beginning punishment. Okay, let's say many people think that by abandoning our belief that we are free, and consequently we may be responsible for what we do. This idea roots morality and the theory of punishment. Well, people think that by abandoning the idea of free will, the theory of justice would be much better. These are revisionary views of punishment. This is a quotation from a famous article. At this time, nowadays, the law deals firmly but mercifully with individuals whose behavior is obviously the product of forces that are ultimately beyond their control. Okay, so people who are out of their mind, have serious mental problems, are not punished even if they did bad actions because they are not responsible. We don't think they are responsible because they didn't act freely, of course. And so we don't punish them. We can contain them, put them in sanitary institutions, but we don't punish them. We treat them mercifully. Well, someday the law may treat all convicted criminals this way. That is humanly. When is this someday? When we'll admit that free will doesn't exist. Free will doesn't exist, so nobody ever is responsible for what they do. Okay? Never. So there is not such a thing as guilt or bad actions or sin. All these categories here, they're all wrong. So we shouldn't ever think that punishment can be just or unjust. Punishment can be useful. I mean, sometimes we put people in jail because we think they set an example, but it's not that they deserve punishment. No one ever deserved punishment. These are Joshua Green and Jonathan Coyne, who these two phrases are from an article of theirs, very famous. And these are other people that have this idea. Rain, Corrado, Gazzaniga, Harris, Pereboom, Caruana, and Caruso. All these people argue that there is no free will. Moral responsibility is not at all of the kind we think traditionally accept, like the idea that we are responsible, we act freely. No, nothing like that is true. So we should change our moral system, and we should change our conception of punishment. This is the idea. I said that for Sapolsky. Let me repeat it. There are 2 points here. First, free will is an illusion. Second, and it's good that we have finally acknowledged that, because this would make the theory of punishment much more humane. So will give us progress. Okay? The 2 ideas. Free will doesn't exist, it's an illusion, and punishment has to be restructured consequently, and this is a very good thing. I will deny both views. I will argue that there is no reason to abandon our view of free will or our faith in free will, and then even if we had to abandon it, that wouldn't be good at all, and I will explain why. Okay, what are the arguments these people offer against free will? Patricia Churchland, who is a philosopher, but is the champion of neurophilosophy, so the champion of scientific naturalism. And let's see what she says. So now she talks about one of the main positive views of free will. So the idea that we are free as long as we are not determined. So defendants of this idea includes Epicurus, Kant, Peirce, James, nowadays Roger Penrose, who got the Nobel Prize for Physics a few years ago, and John Searle, and Robert Caine. Okay, let's see what she says about that. A rigid philosophical tradition claims that no choice is free unless it is uncaused. That is, unless the will is exercised independently of all causal influences, in a causal vacuum. A philosophy dedicated to uncaused choice is as unrealistic as a philosophy dedicated to a flat earth. Okay, let me anticipate something I will say later. No one defends this view of free will. I wonder if anybody has ever defended that. Kant did something similar, but he put, as you may remember, he said, you will never find such a kind of agency based on a causal vacuum in the world of phenomena. You have to think of the world of noumena, who have an uncaused cause. Now, philosophers who defend a libertarian view, so a view that bases free will on indeterminism, talk about probabilistic causation. They don't think that there is such a thing as absolute a choice based on no determination, totally uncaused. We are inclined for these philosophers by past causes. It's not that we act freely because we are not caused at all. But we'll say more about that. So anyway, in one word, she is attacking a straw man. No one defends this view of that free will requires a causal vehicle. And then Stephen Hawking, again, that's spelled correct, on predetermination. The ultimate objective test of free will, seems to be, this is on word, can one predict the behavior of the organism? If one can, then it clearly doesn't have free will, but it's predetermined. So if you are predetermined, that means determined, you cannot have free will. If you can predict somebody, then you are determined, and so you don't have free will. On the other hand, if one cannot predict the behavior, one could take that as an operational definition that organism has free will. So his point is this. If we can predict the behavior of an organism, then we can say that this organism is not free. If you cannot predict it, you could wrongly assume that this is because the organism has free will. However, the real reason why we cannot predict human behavior is that it is just too difficult. We already know the basic physical laws that govern the activity of the brain, and they are comparatively simple. So we all have the secret of the universe already explained, but it's just too hard to solve the equations when there are more than a few particles involved. So in principle, it would be possible to prove that we are determined. And this would, of course, prove that we are not free, because determinism for Hawking, as for many others, is the proof that is incompatible with free will. But because we cannot predict it, because we are not good enough at the math that is necessary there, we wrongly assume that we are free. This is his argument. And then there is Harris that, perhaps unknowing to himself, really seems to talk about amor fati, like Spinoza or Nietzsche would. He says, compatibilism is the idea that free will and determinism are compatible. So it's the other view, right? One roots libertarianism, roots free will in indeterminism. Compatibilism says, no, free will is compatible with determinism. Defendants of this view include Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Leibniz, John Stuart Mill, Daniel Dennett. Compatibilism amounts to nothing more than an assertion of the following creed: a puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. I repeat that in his own book, Free Will, there is a puppet on the cover, and the puppet is representing us. So we love our strings, and he says, compatibility ignores the very source of our belief in free will, the feeling of a conscious agency. People feel that they are the authors of their thoughts and actions, and this is the only reason why there seems to be a problem of free will worth talking about. Because we feel it. We love our strings to the point that we think that they are ours, really, that we are in charge of these strings. The strings would be the laws of the universe. We are not in charge of them. We cannot be free. So it's a kind of a amor fati, really, that is, for Harris, treated as if it was a proof of free will. Okay, now let's go. These are more, sketches of reasonings against free will. Let's give a couple of arguments. The first is this. This is an experiment a few years ago that is the last and perhaps most spectacular example of kind of an experiment, specific kind of experiments that derive from the experiments that Benjamin Libet, a neurophysiologist from California, did on starting in the 70s. The idea, briefly said, is this. We can prove experimentally that then when we make a choice, it seems to us that we consciously cause that choice. But actually, the real cause is neurological. So it's neurological, and being a neurological, so kind of a deactivation of some parts of the brain. If this is the case, if the real cause of my acting is an activation of some neurons, then it cannot be that I'm in control of what I do. So it cannot be a free action. Okay, let's look a little better. Let's start from the title. Unconscious determinants of free decisions in the human brain. So the idea here is this. Let's take any free decision, where free decision for them means something we are something that we take to be free. Okay, and then it will prove, this experiment will show that these free decisions actually have unconscious determinants. Unconscious determinants in the human brain. So neurological events that cause my decisions. The beginning of the article clarifies what it says. The impression that we are able to freely choose between different possible courses of action is fundamental to our mental life. Free will. We assume that free will is fundamental for us. However, it has been suggested by Benjamin Libet and his followers that this subjective experience of freedom is no more than an illusion. So there is no objective freedom corresponding to the subjective experience of freedom, and that our actions are initiated by unconscious mental processes long before we become aware of our intention to act. So even before I decide what to do, my brain has decided for me. Let's read the abstract. There has been, at least the beginning of the abstract, there has been a long controversy started by Libet as to whether subjectively free decisions are determined by brain activity ahead of time, free in commas. We found that the outcome of a decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. So up to 10 seconds before I decide, the brain has decided for me. How does this experiment work? Well, let's read it here. The subjects are the activity, the mental brain activity of the subjects is measured with an fMRI, okay? Functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we know what's going on in the brain of these subjects. And they are asked to relax while fixating on the center of the screen of a computer where a stream of letters was presented. Now, so in the computer, I look at the computer, and there are letters A, B, C, quickly changing. This is like a watch, okay? This is intended to be the way in which I know when I decided to act. There was a cue on the screen when I decided to act. And what is the action I'm asked to perform? The subjects were asked to relax while fixating on the center of the screen where a stream of letters was presented. At some point, when they felt the urge to do so, they were to freely decide between one or two buttons operated by the left and right index fingers and press it immediately. In parallel, they should remember the letter presented when the mode of decision was consciously made. So I relaxed for 50 times. The experiment is repeated 50 times. For 50 times, I'm said, you have to press the right or the left button. You relax. When you feel the urge, means when you make the decision, you look what letter is there and press immediately the button. So I relax, I decide to push, there is a cue on the screen. That's the moment I press. Well, the fMRI proves that up to 10 seconds earlier, there was a neurological activity in my brain that was actually the cause of my pressing, for example, the right button, okay? This is repeated for 50 times. So it's pretty scary, right? Let's assume that someone comes, you are in a restaurant, and the restaurant says, do you want, let's assume that you are in Italy, you want pasta or pizza? And you start to think, and then you say, oh, pizza. And he says, look, I'm a famous neuroscientist. I already knew what you were going to decide because you are unaware that we are detecting what is in your brain. 10 seconds earlier, before you decided, we knew that what your decision was. This is according to these people, I know two of them, Marcel Brass and Haynes. This finally proves that freedom cannot be freely, right? Cannot be free, because they are determined by events, brain events, well in advance, of events of which I am totally unaware and on which I cannot exercise any control. So there is no free will. This is one argument, right? So the argument goes that way. I actually cause my actions, but the causations touch much earlier in my brain, and I don't control what is in the brain. So the real cause is not my mental state, my desire, my intention. It is the brain, unconscious brain states. Look at the title, Unconscious Determinants. The determination of my action is unconscious. Unconscious here doesn't mean the Freudian dynamic unconscious. This is the dynamic unconscious, Freudian unconscious, can become conscious through analytic therapy. That's not the case. These are physical chemical events in my brain, and they are the real cause of my choice. So there is no space of freedom here. This is one argument, comes from neuroscience. Another one comes from more social psychology, cognitive science. And it's based on the idea that our consciousness is totally opaque to us, to what happens to us. And then actually mental states, intentional mental states, beliefs, desires, intentions, and the other conscious mental states do not play any causal role in our acting. In one word, the conscious mind is epiphenomenal, doesn't have any causal power. When I do something, my intentional mental states, conscious mental states, are causally irrelevant. I always act for reasons that I don't know, okay? The reasons for which I act, the causes of my acting, are always unknown to me. How do they prove this? They have a battery of interesting examples. One, I'm sure you know it, the Milgram experiments. So people can do terrible things, obey terrible orders, without even realizing what they are doing, really. And this is the famous couple of cognitive psychologists, Nisbet and Wilson. This is their experiment, famous one of the many they performed. They go outside a mall, one of these terrible buildings, and they go outside one of store in the mall, and they put there a stand with 4 women's stockings, black women's stockings. And they ask people who pass by, what is the best of these 4 pair of stockings? And 90% of the people say that the best pair of stockings is the one on their right side. And they ask why. And people say, oh, look at the texture, the luminosity, the material, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Because the 4 pair of stockings are identical. And the real reason why we prefer the one on our right is that we privilege the right hand to the left hand, 90% of us. And so we, in some sense, have a bias in favor of the right side. That's the reason why we pick the stockings on the right. Nothing more than that. And we invented an explanation of why we prefer the right side, but actually the real reason we didn't know about. We were totally unaware of the reason why we picked the stockings on the right side. So their idea is that there are many other people, for example, Daniel Wegner, famous psychologist that passed away some years ago, our conscious will is just causally inefficacious. A very interesting example comes also from Hall and Johansson experiments. There is a great YouTube video by them. So what is this experiment here, for example? People have to choose, the experimenter shows them a couples of cards with pictures. So people of same age, same sex, different. And so you have to choose which one you prefer. Here, for example, between these two, a person says that. So this card is given to you, you look at it closer, and then you explain why you choose it. Well, at some point, the experimenters make a trick. And when you choose this, they give this to you. 90% of the people don't realize that this is the other card. Okay, this is about our concentration. But the interesting thing is that they will explain the choice they haven't made as if it were their own choice. So they chose this, and this is given to you, and you start to say, oh, I like dark hair more than brown hair. You invent an explanation of a choice you haven't made. And this is in many cases. There are sciences in this. Nobel Prizes have been given for that finding. So think about Richard Thaler and his nudging. The idea is that we tend to overestimate what we can do. Actually, we don't do much rationally or consciously. What we do is unconscious. We don't know why we act the way we act. Johansson calls his view choice blindness. The idea that when we don't know, we are blind to why we make the choices we make. If we are blind on the reasons why we make the choices that we make, this means that free will is impossible. Free will requires that we choose to act in one way or the other. And what we consciously choose here is not why we acted that way, because they can change even what we have done. We would invent another explanation. So their idea is that whatever we choose, we always invent an explanation in conscious terms, or what indeed in reality is caused unconsciously by unconscious factors that we are unaware of. So all this seems to be the conscious mind is epiphenomenal. The conscious mind, conscious states, intentions, beliefs, desires don't have any causal power. So we never exercise any causal power, conscious causal power on our actions. So free will is an illusion. This is different from the neurological argument, right? The neurological argument said, I act, but there is a previous cause that is unconscious. But this previous cause perhaps causes my mental actions. So the idea there is that my mental actions, conscious mental actions, are caused by something that is unconscious. Here is more radical. My conscious states don't do any causal work. So the conscious mind is totally inefficacious. It's an epiphenomenon. So it's a stronger argument. Okay, now let's quickly say something about free will, some philosophical basics, and then we'll discuss these arguments. There are two conditions of free will, generally. People agree on that. We need to have different possibilities of action, and then we have to determine ourselves which of these actions will become actualized. So, for example, when we go to the restaurants and we have pasta or pizza, we like to think that we could choose either, and then we decide which one we choose, okay? So there are alternative possibilities, and we determine consciously which one of these possibilities is realized. Now, this seems that's at odds with the way the world is structured. More specifically, whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic, it doesn't seem that there is a space for free will when free will is intended as the something that has these two conditions, and that everybody agrees on these two conditions, more or less. Interpreted differently, but these are the conditions people are happy with in defining free will. Well, the idea is that neither in the deterministic world nor in the indeterministic world, these two conditions can be given together. Let's see why. Determinism is the idea that each event is determined by the previous events and the laws of nature. This is for the most perverse among you. Just a logical presentation of this idea. And indeterminism is the idea that determinism is false, okay? Well, this is the idea of free will, our intuition, a diagram of our intuition of free will. The past is given, but the future is open. And at the moment of the present, this here should be go here. At the moment of the present, I choose which one of the two future will be realized. However, if the universe is deterministic, there are no alternative possibilities, right? Because if the future is deterministic, everything is determined by the past according to the laws of nature. And if the world is indeterministic, it seems that we have free will. We don't, because when we deliberate, let's assume that there is free will. Roger Penrose, for example, thinks that when there is free will, there are some indeterministic moments in our brain, and neurotubules in the brain, that generates, from which new causal chains begins, that are not, of course, they are not determined. The only problem here, that seems that there is no self-control. Because in determinism, quantum indeterminism, even if it's just probabilistic, not the pure chance, well, that thing there doesn't seem to produce freedom at all. It seems that randomness produces something that is very far away from freedom. As David Hume said, in the contingency, freedom only produce randomness, they don't produce freedom. If, you know, it's like every time we act, we toss a coin and we decide accordingly. Self-determination is not possible in that scenario. Okay, let's hope we don't want that. Self-determination is impossible in that scenario. So if determinism is true, there are no alternative possibilities. If indeterminism is true, there is no self-control. So where is free will here? Now, let's start. This is the difficult situation. David Hume said that free will is the most difficult science, the most difficult metaphysics. But still, philosophers try to give arguments. And let's see how philosophers can reply to the scientific arguments that we have seen before. First, that's generally speaking about the scientific view of philosophy. So philosophy should be reduced to science. Then it stops us from thinking that way. There is not such a thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. And then it is a philosopher who really cares about the relationship between science and philosophy. But it's not a relation of pure subordination of philosophy to science, because science itself has some philosophy involved in its substance, right? There are philosophical notions, issues that are at the hardcore of science. Think about quantum mechanics. A lot of philosophy there, or the theory of evolution. A lot of philosophical issues are in the scientific theories. So that's a premise. But then let's go how philosophers try to answer the problem of freedom. So a couple are pessimistic. Illusionism or pessimism is the view that is an ontologically skeptic view. There is no free will, it's just an illusion. Then there is an epistemologically skeptic view, Mysterianism, like Chomsky or Wegner. They say, look, we don't understand freedom, free will. We are not smart enough. Our species is not smart enough. Of course, there is an explanation of free will, but we can't simply understand it. We are not smart enough, exactly in the same sense as in which a dog couldn't understand the Pythagoras theorem. And then there are two positive views that I already mentioned. One is libertarianism. Free will is rooted in indeterminism. And here people, in order to avoid the criticism, look, indeterminism only produces randomness. Most of the philosophers who defend libertarianism nowadays think about agent causation. So agents have a special kind of causal power. That's not just event causation, it's agent causation. That is a possibility of starting new causal chains without being determined to do so. You can be inclined, you can be probabilistically inclined to do something instead of something else, but still you have the freedom to decide. This is libertarianism. And then compatibilism, that is by large the most popular view. And this is the idea that free will and determinism are compatible. This seems paradoxical. Is the least popular view with common sense, but it's the most popular with philosophers. I'll say something in 1 minute about this view. Because think about this. Let's go back to this experiment. You remember that they pretend to say, look, there is no free will because everything we decide consciously has a previous cause that is totally unconscious. Well, there are reasons that for thinking that this is not working. That is not true. That this argument, the argument of this experiment, really proves that there are no free decisions or free will. One argument is this: does this experiment really concern free decisions, even only in the subjective sense? Remember the title: Unconscious Determinants of Free Decisions in the Human Brain. And so the example of pushing the button, pressing the button for 50 times would be an example of free decisions. Well, how to define free decisions? You remember what we read here, right? At some point, when the subject felt the urge to do so, they were to freely decide between one or two buttons and then press it immediately. When the subject's urge felt the urge to press one of the two buttons. That's the mark of the free decisions for this experiment, or for the Libet tradition in general. Well, that's not very convincing, because feeling the urge to do something is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition of a free decision. Let's assume that when I drive, I go around, I don't feel the urge to go on the right side. I just do. Now I'm talking. I don't feel the urge to talk. I just do. So, and I feel these are free decisions. I decide to say what I'm saying. I don't feel any urge. So the urge is not a necessary condition of a free decision, but it's not even a sufficient condition. If I now feel that I have to sneeze, and I sneeze, there is the urge to sneeze, but there is no free decision. So this proves that a free decision is not even an urge is not even a sufficient condition of a free decision. So the behavior we have when we feel the urge to do something is something that is very little overlapping with the kind of behavior we have when we have a free decision, a genuinely free decision. What we feel is a genuinely free decision. There is at most a little overlapping, but they are two different things. When we act for a free decision, we don't feel any urge very frequently. So this is one objection. This experiment doesn't talk about free decisions in general. It talks about a very different kind of decisions. But there is more. That was the first. The second, the experiment is called Unconscious Determinants of Free Decisions in the Human Brain. We have said, no. The decisions in the experiment are not free. And the question is, are they at least genuine? They are not. And the reason is that this is John Nash, but then there is von Neumann. They define what a decision is in decision theory. That's just a formalization of a common sense view. A decision is a choice made in a situation of uncertainty when, in choosing between possible alternatives, an agent considers her preferences. So what I'm saying is, if you have to press 50 times at the right or the left button, you do it, but you don't have any preference to do the one or the other. You don't care. So it's not a genuine decision. So this experiment that is presented as the proof that we don't have free decisions doesn't talk about free decisions at all. Not just because it's not free decisions, it's not even about decisions in the most important sense. And the last argument, what is the view of free will that is corroborated by this experiment? Of course, you can, if you are an illusionist, free will doesn't exist, or a Mysterian, we don't understand free will, you can accept this experiment. Okay. And say, okay, it proves again, even if we didn't need this proof, that we don't have free will or we don't know enough about free will. But the two positive views, compatibilism and libertarianism, could still be happy because the ratio of approximation the ratio of mistakes that experimenters do in predicting what will be pressed, the right or the left button, is only 60%. So in 40% of the cases, the prediction is wrong by the scientist. So people would say, oh, this proved that, we are not determined. You just guess, and sometimes you get, even if it's not real choice, but, sometimes you guess it. But in most cases, you don't. you can be wrong because, you don't really know. There is no determinism at stake there. And that's one way libertarians can be happy with this experiment and say, who cares about it? Compatibilists are even happier. Compatibilists don't care about this experiment. Compatibilists are the ones who say that all our free actions and decisions are caused deterministically because determinism is true. If it's so, who cares that there are unconscious determinants of our brain? Of course there are. Everything is determined. And actually, it's much more radical than the free decision. My free decisions is caused by brain activity 10 seconds before. It's caused by the Big Bang, 15 billion years before, because everything else follows deterministically, at least at the macro world, without considering the subatomic world, where perhaps there is indeterminism. But who cares? General relativity says that the world is deterministic. Of course, we are determined. But a compatibilist will say, look, what really cares if the decision is mine or someone else's. If the waiter comes to you and says, you want pasta or pizza? You say, I want pasta. And he said, I already knew that because I am a neuroscientist. I knew what was in your brain that, causing your choice. You are not free. If you're a compatibilist, you respond, who cares? I want pasta. I ordered pasta. That's my free will. This is the free will worth wanting, as Dennett would say. Okay? So they say determinism is, determinism is just a good condition for free will. Because the important thing is that my will is determined, but my will is not your will, it's someone else's will. I want pasta, I order pasta. That's everything I need to have in order to have free will. That means free action. An action caused by my conscious states. That's the idea. Okay, what about this? You remember this, right? The idea that all the experiments showing we never know why we act. We always invent rationalizations, confabulations about why we made a choice and another, but we are unaware of what the real reasons were. Okay, here the argument is this is very interesting. In many cases it's true, but it is not always true. Let's assume that someone wants to marry another person because the other person is very rich and they marry. The person who married because of this self-interested belief and desire, he knows or she knows perfectly why he or she did that. That was the cause of his or her behavior. So it's not true that in all cases we don't know why we choose things. There are cases when we are concentrated and focused where we perfectly know why we choose what we know, what we do choose. So even this argument that we never know why we choose, so there is no free will, it's not really working. There are cases in which we do. Can be not so as frequent as we would like, but there are. If I go to the supermarket, I don't pay attention. Probably I will be determined by external factors, the advertisement I saw, the disposition on the shelves. But if I am concentrated and focused, I can choose according to my real taste. Okay, so the question of punishment, very quickly. You remember that people said, okay, guys, it would be nice if we had free will abandoned because this would be good for punishment. I said there is no reason to abandon free will. Now I'm going to briefly prove, almost done, I briefly prove that it would be a disaster for justice if free will was abandoned. These are the 4 reasons for justifying punishment. We can think that punishment is good because we want people to be rehabilitated. We want punishment is just because some people deserve retribution, the punishment, or deterrence. We think that punishment is good because it's useful to deter other people, other potential criminals. And capacitation. We want to put some people in jail, for example, because they are dangerous. Notice here that there is a difference here between 2 kinds of justifications of punishment. One is a deontological justification. It's backward-looking, retribution. Someone has done something for which they deserve to be punished. This goes, look backward. It's deontological. Punishment is something that has to be done even if it doesn't have good consequences. Kant's view, Immanuel Kant's view. And the other 3 are actually different because they look at the future. They look at the consequences. They are utilitarian. So you are justified in punishing when, someone could be plausibly rehabilitated. So let's give punishment to that person. It's good for them. They perhaps will be better people at the end. Or other potential criminals, deterrents, will be scared. And so this is useful. Or it's useful to incapacitate people, to put people in prison because they are dangerous. So look at the distinction. Deontological justifications are backward-looking, and utilitarian justifications are forward-looking. And then there is a hybrid view that is restorative justice. That's not very important here. The important thing here is that retribution requires notions like merit, desert, responsibility. Someone could merit to be punished or not. If they merit to be punished, they should be punished. So free will is here. A person who merit deserves punishment because they did intentionally, freely, something that they shouldn't have done. You can only be justly punished if you did something freely. Otherwise, you shouldn't be punished at all. Utilitarian justifications are of a different kind. There is no merit, no desert, no rehabilitation, only the utility of punishment. And then there is a risk then. Why? Because if you abandon, as people would be happy with, the ontological justification, you abandon the idea that retribution is a good justification of punishment. You abandon the two properties of retributivism or retribution, two different kinds of deserts that are involved in retributivism. One is positive desert. Offenders deserve punishment for their wrongful acts. This is the French Revolution. And so when many people were punished because Robespierre wanted to punish all the guilty people. So just to be sure, he punished more people than the guilty ones, just to be sure that he would get all the guilty ones. And so to mitigate this view, there is negative desert. It is morally unacceptable to punish those who do not deserve to be punished and punish them in a non-proportional way. This is Sherlock Holmes, who is infallible here. So negative desert is the idea you shouldn't punish people who do not deserve to be punished. Now, the risk is, if you don't have free will, you abandon desert in general, both positive and negative, because there is not much sense in talking about desert anymore, because desert requires more responsibility requires free will. So people deserve to be punished because they freely did something. And if they don't deserve it because they didn't intentionally or freely did something. So desert is essentially rooted in free will. But if you abandon free will, you have to abandon the idea of desert. And you are left in a purely consequentialist, utilitarian scenario. And so this is the punishment. The consequence that you can have scapegoating. You punish, this is World War I, decimations. Then when, random executions of your own soldiers. So the others will be intimidated and would fight more heroically, or excessive punishment that are given to people to set an example for the others. Would be intuitive to think that these kind of punishments are wrong, but you can say that they are wrong only if you have the notion of deserved. No one deserves to be executed if they weren't responsible. No one would deserve such a harsh punishment. But if you don't have the notion of desert anymore, you cannot say that. You have to live with absolutely consequentialist utilitarian view of punishment. So let me close this and then I close the discussion. This is Hart, the most important jurist. Okay, what a face as an Oxford professor. The most important jurist of last century. His view of punishment. He has a utilitarian justification of punishment. He does. The only people who should be punished are those who would be socially useful to punishment. Okay, that's his definition, but he had something. He had the negative desert constraint on the distribution of punishment. He says, no person should be punished who does not deserve to be punished, even if her punishment might be socially useful. So you cannot punish people who do not deserve to be punished. That's a pillar of his view, even if he's a utilitarian philosopher. So if you don't want pure utilitarianism, you want to have a space for negative desert. In order to preserve that, you cannot abandon free will. Conclusions. There is no convincing empirical argument supports the idea that free will is illusory. Only fallacious inferences and overambitious metaphysics do. And this is, let me conclude with the phrase of a dear friend and great philosopher. She passed away some years ago, Lynn Baker. She wrote, and there is some Aristotelian flavor here. We should not lend faith to metaphysics that render ordinary but significant phenomenon unintelligible. And this is what would exactly happen if we abandon the idea of free will.
Thank you very much for the talk, Mario.
Sorry? I finished.
Yeah, thank you very much. Usually
Thank you.
we take a 5-minute break if you're okay with that, so that you can take a cup of water and before the Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, what time is it?
It's 3 minutes past.
Okay, so we resume at 10.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Are you fine, Marco? Are you ready to start again?
Okay.
Okay, so let's start the Q&A. For people online, I will ask the question from the room first, and then I will open discussion for people online. Maybe it's better if you write the question on the chat and that we can read them. Well, that's just a question of modalities, but yeah, let's start first with the room. Questions in the room? Are there no questions? Okay, so Marco, if you want to ask a question, I guess you're up.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
maybe one question.
Do I have to write my question or can I?
I mean, you can ask them. For the others, if you want to ask a question, please put your hands up so that we can do the selection and do the ordering.
Okay, so thank you.
Are you there, Mario?
Mario?
Are you there, Mario? You're frozen on our computer. Okay. Okay. Wait.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Now I'm with my cellular phone.
Okay. Can you hear us fine still?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, cool. So Marco, you're up.
So thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And I do have actually some
Oh, I have two.
to the Caro.
Yeah. Yeah, please go. Yeah, please go.
Yeah, so you provide some argument, some criticism concerning the fact that we don't have to abandon the free will, and you gave a very interesting case in which there is an experiment, and and you criticize the fact that we are talking about decision or free decision. And after that, you argue that we cannot abandon free will because could be some problem for justice. But in general, I would like to ask you, what is free will for you? What kind of systematization you would like to propose? And concerning the 2 points that you mentioned, alternative possibilities and self-determination, I do have also a curiosity about, for example, the first point, because this is really, I don't know nothing concerning this, it's just a curiosity, because it seems to me that when you mention alternative possibilities, you have to have already the possibility there, and then you can choose between one of them. And I was wondering if free will depend also on the capacity to looking for or find these alternative possibilities, or if these possibilities are all the time predetermined. It's only about we have some possibility already there and we have to choose, or part of the process of free will also to find these possibilities. Thank you so much.
Okay, so different questions. I gave a definition that is very neutral about the different views of free will, the positive views of free will. I didn't want to be committed to a particular view because here the point was a critical point against people who deny free will on a scientific basis. As about the alternatives possibilities, there is a huge discussion here. The first point to notice is that if you are a compatibilist, you believe that free will is compatible with determinism. And certainly determinism clearly denies alternative possibilities because there is only one future that's possible, the one that's determined according to the laws of nature given the past. So what is there? Okay, here, both, already some way Hobbes, then Locke, and then Hume, and then other philosophers in the following centuries have given an answer to that. When we think, according to many compatibilists who believe that free will is compatible with determinism, when we say that we have alternative possibilities, we do not mean that objectively categorically, there are two different futures open to us, because if determinism is true, that is not the case. What we mean is a conditional interpretation of alternative, not a categorical one, of alternative possibilities. It is not that when I say I could do differently, I mean that, there were two real open scenarios there, like two parallel universes, and I pick one. What I meant is, if I wanted to do something different, I could do something different. Of course, I wanted pasta, so I ordered pasta. I ordered pasta because, of course, I'm determined to want pasta. My story, what I did yesterday, what I heard about this restaurant, infinite reasons determine what I wanted. But if I wanted pizza, I could order pizza. That was exactly what was going on in that restaurant. So there is a lot of discussion. G. Moore has important points about that. There is a lot of discussion, but so is the way this conditional interpretation of the alternative possibilities, what characterizes compatibilism. And then about what are these conditions? It depends. So alternative possibilities, what are them? If you are a libertarian, you think they are categorical, ontologically, futures that are ontologically possible. If you are a determinist, compatibilist, you think that they are not ontologically possible, but they are conditionally possible. If I wanted something different, I could do something different. And about my way of defining free will, I would add certainly something like the connection with reasons. So including the why I did something freely, there has to be rational reasons for my behaviors, not just that I wanted to do something. Let me give you an example. If I am an alcohol addict, I would like to stop drinking, but I cannot control my impulses. That's not, when I drink, the next glass of beer, that's not out of free will. Okay, even if I did it, I in some sense wanted to do it, but that is not my deepest will, my deepest desire, my most rooted desire. Is not what the reason I should have, and I know I shouldn't have that reason for drinking, like, just satisfy my impulses. This is something that is very much discussed in the last years. So the idea here is by Frankfurt, for example, Henry Frankfurt. So one thing is the thing that come out of my deepest self, and this is what I identify with, and this is one when in that sense, I could be free if I act out of these beliefs of mine. If I act because, out of impulses, that's not free will.
Thank you. Do you have
so
some?
much.
Oh. Okay. No, still no question in the room. Azat, maybe.
I see one question in the room, actually.
Yes. Yeah, maybe Jacques first, because you were asked question already during the talk. So if you want to, you're up.
Yes, my question is relative to what is called determinism. What is usually taken into account in all disciplines is the determinism of initial conditions, and still not yet the determination of the final conditions. While there is more than 50 years now that it was demonstrated that the evolution of any complex system, from the hurricane up to our behavior and the behavior of biological system, is their evolution towards the final equilibrium, the dissipative structure of Ilya Prigozhin. And so we have to take into account the two kinds of determinism. And if there are societies that are focused on going and increasing the dissipation of energy, it's definitely our societies which are near to the end of that kind. So I was always surprised that these two kinds of determinism are not taken into account.
No, they are actually. They are. For example, Timothy O'Connor really relies on Prigozhin account for describing his agential libertarianism, causal agential libertarianism. That's normally considered not because the determinism is not, is a definition. It's a definition that comes out of Newtonian physics and theory of general relativity. So it says. So it doesn't apply, of course, to quantum mechanics, but it applies to chaotic systems. It does apply to chaotic systems because the problem with chaotic systems is epistemological, it's not ontological. Chaotic systems are generally considered deterministic in the sense that there is determinism, everything is determined by previous conditions according to the laws of nature, but they are unpredictable in principle. So this is one thing. The chaotic systems are deterministic but unpredictable. So determinism is not the same thing as predictability. You are totally right. But another thing is Prigozhin and these other ideas, and especially in free will theory, for example, Roger Penrose, Nobel Prize for Physics, he thinks that there is a magnification of quantum indeterminacies in the brain and the microtubules. So this kind of indeterminism is magnified to the macro level where we live and neurons are active, and then there is indeterminism at the level of the brain and so of human action. So we have to be, what you said is considered in this debate, just there are different definitions what determinism is. But the main one, the official one, is determinism is the idea that all events in the universe are caused by previous states of the universe according to the laws of nature. This has to be distinct. The case of chaotic systems is different, and the case of indeterminism in the sense of Penrose or Prigozhin is still another.
Do you have a reply, Jacques? Or...
Okay, but again, I think that is this second kind of determinism that it makes that chance is not the only. And it's not only by chance that the things are evolving, they are focused, and for example, biological evolution is towards this more great efficiency of and the most efficient and more dissipative species is probably the human species.
No,
and
no,
that's
but
why
that's
they emerged.
Yeah, they emerge based on some form of indeterminism. And that's exactly what some libertarians do, as Tim O'Connor. People who are compatibilists, some compatibilists actually would accept that, saying, I don't care if the world is deterministic or not. I only know that freedom is also compatible with determinism. So they would accept your view, perhaps, and say, but that's free will doesn't really depend on the world being deterministic or indeterministic. Your form of indeterminism is perfectly acceptable. So that's a view that actually, and Tim O'Connor is the main defender of agent causation now, and he deeply rely on Prigogine.
Thank you. So, Azad, you had a question?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. When you presented all these many different arguments against free will, I don't remember who it was, but some of them was phrased like there is no place for free will in science. And then when you criticize the sort of metaphysical inference from a scientific empirical experiment, in the end, you provided a sort of justification for us to keep free will, which comes from justice and jurisprudence. But it's still interesting for me, whether you think there is a place for free will in science.
Okay, there are two answers here. One is the answer of some scientists. I mentioned Penrose. Penrose believes that there is space in free will in science, and actually free will requires indeterminism that comes from quantum mechanics. As you know, most interpretations of quantum mechanics are indeterministic. Not them all. Bohm's interpretation of the multi-world interpretations are deterministic, but many interpretations are indeterministic. And according to Penrose, they are needed for free will. So certainly he would agree that there is a space for free will in science. But my point is different. And other people would defend determinism, saying, there is space for free will in the natural world because, what is necessary that we are determined, but what we do sometimes is determined by my own reasons. And my own reasons are determined by my brain, that is a chemical physical system. But something more. Being a liberal naturalist, I think that there are parts of the world that for whose existence the natural world is necessary, but that cannot be completely explained by natural sciences. And this is when normativity is implied. When normativity is implied, the explanations of free will, of science, natural sciences are not enough. We need something more. Natural sciences cannot account for normative phenomena. And when you talk about morality and responsibility, you talk about normative phenomena. What should be done is different. Science doesn't talk about what should be done. Science only talks about what is done. And so there, in that sense, in order to have free entities like us, you need some natural conditions. We need to have, the body we have. We need to obey to the laws of nature. But in order to explain, at some level of explanations, of our behavior, the natural sciences are not enough anymore. You need something more. And this is the normative explanations of morality or philosophy, perhaps for some people, religion. These are different levels of explanation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions? Josué?
Thank you also for your presentation. My English is not good, so I don't know, maybe I will express myself in French and
French you have to speak it slowly.
I just want to know if except the consequential argument to defend the free will, can you provide us another argument to defend the free will?
Sorry, what? Which argument?
You want another argument than the consequentialist one for free will? Okay.
So I mentioned consequentialism, not about free will. I mentioned consequentialism has a theory of morality and punishment. So their idea is that a moral action is an action whose consequences are better than the other options. And then what is better means here depends on the different theories. So take this difference. A deontological ethics is one that says what is right depends on the principle that you are instantiated in your choice. Kant, the categorical imperative, or the Ten Commandments. Consequences of the action don't define at all if the action is correct or not. For consequentialists, instead, what really matters is the unpredictable consequences of your actions. So for a utilitarian in particular, an action is good if it's the one that maximizes the happiness or the pleasure or the welfare or the utility of the highest number of people. This is a classic definition. Then what matters is the consequences. But all this is connected with morality, moral responsibility, not directly with free will. Is connected with the particular application of free will, the field of morality, when you act freely and your actions, then in some cases, if they concern moral situations, can be defined moral or immoral. For a consequentialist, in order to define an action that was accomplished freely as moral or immoral, you only have to look at its consequences, not the principles that inform that action. Okay?
Is it okay? You have a question, Peter?
Yeah. So thanks a lot for your talk. I agree with almost everything you said. But there's first a remark and then a question, maybe. So people like Sapolsky and so on, I think they have very bad arguments against free will. Well, I don't know whether many philosophers take it seriously what they claim. In any case, I've always found it very funny that the quote you showed yourself is almost internally incoherent, given that it says that well, it's an illusion. Free will is an illusion. But if we choose to accept or believe that it is an illusion, then that will be good for some reasons, right? So we can choose to not believe in free will, but we don't have free will. So that there is an internal inconsistency there.
Can I add something on that?
Yes.
I totally agree, but that says even more general. When you talk, you're assuming that you are saying something freely in general besides this particular issue. And you want to influence that the other accepts your reasons for what you are saying. You are offering reasons, right? Especially in philosophy. But all this would be meaningless if there is not such a thing as freedom, of course. All my offering reasons to you, you're accepting my reasons based on rational exchange. Rationality would collapse without free will.
Yes. So I fully agree. But I actually had even the impression that it's not a good game to play as scientists themselves, because they could actually offer a lot in these free will discussions. Because with these kinds of experiments that they think about, they could make distinction between in which cases are we to some extent free, and in which cases it's actually other factors that have played a role or something like that. Or what parts, like where do we situate the subjective experience of free will in our brain, and how far does this the full causation or not, and so on. I mean, there's very interesting like scientific questions to be asked, in my opinion, that you completely lose if you think, for some weird reason, that these kind of very specific experiments and for some very specific behavior could ever lead to conclusions as broad and sweeping as there is no free will. I mean, it feels like they put themselves like out of the game. The irrationality makes them useless, basically. I don't know whether you agree with that point of view.
Yeah, no, that's I think I agree with it. So we have to extract what is good in the experiments we saw, by distinguishing two questions that are two philosophical questions, but they can, up to a point, that can have the contribute to science. I'm not saying that in discussing free will, you shouldn't consider science. I am only saying that science by itself cannot even discuss the issue. One important point is this. Let's distinguish these two questions. One is whether we have free will. Another one, totally different, is when and up to what point we have free will, how much free will we have. And these are two different questions. About the first, we are seeing that science cannot solve the problem. About the second, science can really contribute. The second question is, when is that we have free will? In many cases in which we used to think that we have free will, now we know for scientific reasons that we didn't have free will. There are cases in which we believe we act freely, in which we didn't. And there are a lot of sciences now that exploit, or sciences or disciplines that exploit this. Think about neuromarketing, neuroeconomy, neuropolitics. All these are attempts of exploiting the fact that frequently unknown to us. We think we are free, we are not. So when you enter, I mentioned Richard Thaler. When you enter in a supermarket, if you don't know anything about these issues, you don't know probably that if by default you will pick the products at the supermarket by this and the products that are at the height of your eyes. So when you go there, you look at the same height of your eye, at the level of your sight, and pick the products there. If you know this, you are much more careful. You think, okay, this is, let's go and look more and analyze more if there are other things. There you are exercising free will. The products that are produced by the same supermarket are always at this level, the level of sight, because people know that you will pick, all of us, if we are not concentrated and focused, will pick products from there. It's never than the products of the super, or they are to be very incompetent to put their own products in the bottom, because no one goes there if they are not looking for going there. Okay, this is one issue. Another issue is this. There are more serious reasons for being skeptical about free will. There are serious philosophers, let me give some names. In the past, of course, Spinoza or Schopenhauer, but now more contemporary philosophers like Derk Pereboom, Gregg Caruso, Galen Strawson, all these people are skeptical about free will. What are the arguments they have? Well, about libertarian free will, they insist first that view that simply presuppose indeterminism, like a neo-Epicurean view or Penrose view, are wrong, because in itself, indeterminism seems more an enemy than an ally of free will. Indeterminism causes randomness, and randomness is not what you want when you are talking about free will. There are other libertarians I mentioned, for example, Tim O'Connor, that have this agent causation view. The idea is that as rational agents, we have another kind of causation that is not just event causation. Thomas Reid in History or Carnegie were defendants of this view. So the idea here that when we act freely, we start new causal chains in some sense. But what is this some sense? You need a theory of causation, and there is a lot of discussion there. There is causal pluralism in some form. So it's a tough theory, and some people don't think that is convincing. And then there are the criticism of compatibilism. And this is the main view. So some philosophers think that you cannot really say and prove and even defend the idea that free will and determinism, causal determinism, are compatible. The main reason for that is the so-called consequence argument that Peter Van Wingen and other people came out in the last 4 decades. So more the idea is this. In order to say that you control your own actions, and you want to have control if you want to talk about free will, you need to control all the factors that make your choice work. My choice determines what I do. But how do I control the action I perform? Peter Wegner said famously, in order to control an action, you need to control whatever makes this action unavoidable. And if you are an indeterminist, if you are a compatibilist, if you think that determinism is true, the factors that make your action unavoidable are, because you're a determinist, the past and the laws of nature. But you cannot control either. You cannot control the past because the past is unchangeable. You cannot control the laws of nature because only God perhaps could, because some theological conceptions say that God cannot even change the laws of nature. But anyway, certainly humans cannot control the laws of nature. Because the laws of nature plus the past makes our choices unavoidable, you cannot control them. This is the idea of Peter Van Inwagen. So Peter Van Inwagen says, this is famous, the consequence argument. Our own choices are the product of the past and the laws of nature. And you are a determinist, so you think that this is exactly the case. But if this is the case, you cannot say that you control the actions because you cannot control the factors that make these actions unavoidable, the past and the laws of nature. I don't find this argument really convincing for the simple reason that makes control too strong for a compatibilist. This form of control is something that Kant would have wanted. Kant had this idea of a full control by an agent that is totally undetermined. But for a person who believes in determinism, the kind of control that is really needed is much weaker. Is the idea that you control an action when among the factors that cause that action, there are your own conscious intentional states like desires or intentions. Desires, intentions are among the cause of your actions. That's enough for saying that you control the action. Of course, they cannot be the entire action because other factors are causes of your action. The fact that there is oxygen there, otherwise you would die, is part of the causal set of reasons why you can act, you make an action. So I don't know if you are familiar with the theory of causation. John Mackey had this famous Ainus idea of causation. That's perhaps too complicated, I think. But fundamentally, the idea here is your own intentional states, conscious intentional states, the adequate desires and beliefs are a component, a necessary component of the sufficient cause of your own action. That's enough. That's the kind of control you want. So this is the way of answering Peter Van Inwagen's worry about control.
But I also had a criticism, or not a criticism, but maybe maybe I didn't understand something towards the end. So I'm not at all utilitarian, but it seems to me that one could take a way out of the point you try to make at the end as a full utilitarian by saying that the kind of notion of desert or deservance that we're talking about here is just some sort of causal efficacy thing. So I deserve to be punished not because I have a free will to do whatever I did, but if me as an organism was in the causal chain of what happened or something like that. Something like that.
Yeah, but remember, utilitarian is not about the past, it's about the future. Why is it useful that I'm punished? That's a question you should ask if you are a utilitarian. If you are a utilitarian, perhaps you are not. But if you're a utilitarian, what matters an action good or not is the consequences, not else. One thing is explaining. Of course, they can explain why people are considered worth of punishment. They merit or deserve. That is an explanation. But when you judge if this is good or not, you should look at the consequences of actions. So, is good or not that people were executed in World War I? Now, have you seen the movie Paths of Glory by Stanley Kubrick. That's a perfect, it's a masterpiece. If you haven't seen it, you can go now and watch it instead of listening to me. That's a masterpiece. And so the idea of the movie is a true story. So it's a true story with decimation by the French army. So some people are randomly chosen. There is a trial that is really not a trial, and people are executed, even if they clearly didn't deserve that. And at some point, the defense lawyer says, but they don't deserve to be executed. And general says, you don't understand. It's just to execute them because we want to win the war. And decimations are useful for that. Now, for the sake of the argument, you know which armies executed their own people with decimations, randomly chosen, to set examples, to have their own troops more heroic? The armies that did that were the British, the French, and the Italians. And they won World War I. Whereas the central powers, Austria and Germany, were so much into the Kantian view, the deontological view. For them to execute someone who doesn't deserve to be executed would be unacceptable. So they never did, substantially, they never did a decimation. So we can grant the point. We can grant the point to the general in the movie that, I repeat, is a true story. We can grant that it was useful to execute people with the decimation. But the question we want to ask as moral philosophers is, okay, it was useful, but was it just? It was not. It was not. So this proved that a consequentialist defense of decimations is wrong, because you cannot judge these actions purely looking at the consequences. There are principles that you do not want to violate. One is you don't want to execute innocent people. And this is not consequentialist.
Well, yeah, but then I agree. To be sure, you shouldn't execute people. But the consequentialists, like if it's a hardcore consequentialist, doesn't have to be incoherent. You can really find that one should not kill innocent people, because in general that will have some bad effects.
Yeah, but that's you are referring
about any intentional things or something, or free will, just has to do with consequences of actions. No?
Yeah, but my point was, sorry if I interrupt, because I see your point now. Perhaps I can answer more convincingly for you. Remember, I'm using this only to prove that the point for which, if we abandon free will, the consequences would be good in the field of justice, as Sapolsky and Green and Coyne say, it's wrong. I think the consequences would be bad. Now, you are pointing to another possibility that is open to the utilitarian or consequentialist. This is called rule consequentialism. There are two forms of consequentialism here, or utilitarianism more correctly. One is action consequentialism. So for each action, if you have to judge if the action is good or not, you have to judge the consequences of that specific action. For the sake of the argument, we are assuming that the general was right. Executing those people was useful because the army fought more heroically and they won the war. We can grant that point. If we grant that, act utilitarianism is doomed because we think that these actions were unjust. So consequentialists, utilitarians have tried another way, and this is called rule or norm utilitarianism. It says, in order to accept an action as good, you should accept as good the rule out of these actions, out of which these actions derive. So the rule would be, it's useful to execute people randomly because this is good for winning wars. And so someone could say, oh, but no, that's not true. We cannot accept this rule. This rule is unacceptable. My fear, and many people fear, is that that's the consequentialist, the rule consequentialist doesn't work. Rule consequentialist doesn't work. I repeat, the rule consequentialist says, in order to judge if a particular action is acceptable, you shouldn't simply look at the consequences of that specific action, but the consequences of the rule if applied generally. And people would say, if the rule is executing people for winning wars, your own people, innocent people, for winning war, this is not a principle people should accept. Now, my point is, it's true, they shouldn't accept it, but the reason for which shouldn't accept it is not because we should look at the consequences, because you could always have counterexamples in which that rule, the general, could come out with this idea. Look, your idea that winning, the general would say, is exactly pointing to this principle. Executing people for winning war is just. This is the principle is applying to, because it has good consequences. And we think that we should distinguish between the consequences of this principle, that perhaps it may be right, we would win war, that otherwise we wouldn't win, but we are appealing to a moral intuition. And the moral intuition is that when you judge of these things, you shouldn't look at the consequences. You should look at what is at stake. And what is at stake here is a principle that says that he's innocent, shouldn't ever be executed. That was justice requires. And this is a deontological principle. It's not a consequentialist principle. There is no way in which a norm utilitarianist can answer that problem. The problem is you don't want ever to accept the rule that you don't accept the rule that you shouldn't execute people, not because of its consequences, because we never know. There could be good consequences for that, but it's not the consequence that really matters. It's not that you could prove that executing people is useful for war. You would accept this as a just rule. Could be expedient, could be Machiavellian, could be useful practically, but it's not just.
Okay. Other questions in the room? Nobody has questions? Online? Does people have question online? Well, if not, I have. Okay. Marco has one. Go on, Marco.
Guys, at 4 exactly, I have to leave the room. That's just.
At which time did you say?
No, that at 4 exactly, I have to leave this room. Okay. Okay.
Marco, so then a short question.
No, thank you. I will be very, very quick. No, it's only another question concerning the fact that you defended the importance of free will in justice, but there is a very old debate concerning the people with psychiatric disorder. That in your framework, as you said concerning the alcoholists, that they don't possess this free will. So what is the framework concerning psychiatric disorder, free will, and justice? Thank you.
There are freedom and responsibility comes in level. So, and actually punishment comes in level depending on the level of free will in which you had in performing action. So, some people have had some slight addictions, so they could do more than people who have strong addictions. Of course, you could be considered responsible for having started an addiction. That's something that people normally do. But if the addiction is not something that dependent on your original choices, and the addiction is very strong, there is nothing you can be responsible for. You can still be dangerous, but there is nothing that you could be considered responsible for. So there are levels, and we have to look case by case.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so if no one has question, I have one short question before you leave. Okay. So let me reiterate my thanks for the talk first. So the theory of justice and the free will and everything, it seems to me very individualized or individualistic, and it's normal, it's free will, so we talk about people, but individuals. But I was wondering how sociology or social version of theory of justice fit into your what you were saying, and if it changes something to look at the social level instead of the individual level.
Can you give me an example of what you're intending?
So, you defend free will in your theory of justice because without it, there would be an issue with deserts, But if we look at socially speaking, isn't there something that escapes the question of individual action and individual intention in how we should apply or conduct justice? It is more at the level of epistemic injustice, like in social injustices or something like that. And we should look for social reparation and not just punishment of individuals.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, we want to put, we have a philosophical intuitions here. I think there are good arguments, but there are especially philosophical intuition. One intuition is that in some cases, people without specific mental diseases or not in specific terrible conditions can exercise free will. The level on which you can exercise free will, of course, also influence your other forms of freedom, like political freedom, freedom of thought. So you can be free from the point of view of freedom of free will, but that's a necessary condition of your being politically free, for example, or you're having freedom of expression. But these are also conditioned by other factors. So if you live in a country in which you cannot express your thought, it means that you cannot express the freedom, the free will that you could use in the field of freedom of expression. So remember, there are different forms of freedom depending on what are the limits. This is Max Weber. There is always a limit. The notion of freedom depends on what the limits are. So for free will, the limits can come from the laws of nature, from the conditioning. For freedom of freedom of speech depends on the political situation. Freedom of enterprise depends on the economical limits and so on. Free will is called also metaphysical freedom, is the most basic, but then there are the others. And we certainly want to expand the possibility of being free. One is the free will. That's one thing. It's not up to us. So either we have it or we don't. But then the other forms of freedom are up to us. So political freedom or freedom of expression, freedom of your sexual choices, all these things depend on society. So these are different issues. I think they presuppose in some way free will, but they depend on different social, political, cultural conditions.
Okay, so you wouldn't put sociology as part of sciences that would undermine free will in the same way that physics?
No, I mean, it depends what you mean. If what I'm saying is free will is the expression. You are one thing is the capacity of free will. This is metaphysical. Another one is the exercise of free will in different fields. And certainly, in order to exercise free will, you need to have the right conditions that are also sociological or cultural, or you cannot express your sexuality in a country in which you shouldn't talk about sex. So you only have one specific way of expressing it. There is no sexual freedom there. So the way you express free will depends on some particular social and you need specific conditions, social, cultural, economical. But the capacity of free will, this is a metaphysical issue.
Okay. That's very clear, like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Guys, we have like a very, very short question. We have 2 minutes. No, not very short question. So let me thank you. Let me join me in thanking again Mario for this talk.
Thank you. And I hope to meet you all at some point in person. Who knows?
Yes, we hope so as well. That way we can offer you the beer that we usually offer our speaker. So let's hope that we meet in person at some point. And thank you again. Many thanks again for coming. And have a good day, man.
Okay.